Hello and welcome to this specially extended Sunday Politics. The waiting game continues with all eyes on the DUP and its leader Sir Geoffrey Donaldson. We'll have the latest from our political editor following days of rumour and speculation about when Stormont might return. And the DUP's political opponents are waiting too, and for some their patience is wearing thin. Whatever happens, it's been an eventful year, and with the help of some of the sharpest minds about, we've tried to cover all of it.
What on earth is going on here? We have no government. We have a cost of living crisis. We have a health service in crisis. We have strikes all across the public sector.
What am I looking forward to? I'm looking forward to Geoffrey Donaldson. Does he watch? Does he listen to this? A nice, quiet Christmas, Geoffrey, please.
And to assess and evaluate all of that, I'm joined by two experts stuffed full of opinions. There's been speculation aplenty over the past 48 hours, even though there's been precious little in the way of hard fact to go on. The government and the DUP in particular remain publicly tight-lipped. Let's get right up to date with the very latest. Our political editor, Enda McLafferty, joins me now from our Foyle studio. Enda, what should we read into that weekend email, first of all, to party members from Sir Geoffrey Donaldson?
Well, Mark, this email was circulated to party members after that DUP officer meeting on Friday, where we understand, Mark, there were no decisions taken, there were no votes taken, and indeed, according to one officer who was there, the feeling very much in the room that day is that this is going to be weeks away before it is finally resolved. And then, of course, Sir Geoffrey circulated that email to party members yesterday, making it very clear his party was not going to be distracted by spin, not going to be sidetracked by what he called calendar-led initiatives, and made it very clear that the party was still negotiating hard with the government. But I think what was interesting in that email, Mark, is that he spent an awful lot of time talking about money and talking about the financial settlement. So you can see the party's focus is very much there right now to ensure that whatever is coming from the Treasury will be able to meet the financial challenges facing Northern Ireland right now. And he was using that as an opportunity to remind members how far they've travelled in that process, and much of the credit, he said, for that is very much down to the DUP. So you do come away after reading that email with the feeling perhaps that the DUP has made the calculation that if it gives the nod that is going to go back into the executive before that process around money runs its course, it in a sense weakens the negotiating hand and perhaps make it easier for the Treasury to turn down any future requests for money. So perhaps the DUP is saying, let's get the money dealt with first and then we can deal about the party's position in terms of returning to the executive. But of course the money discussion is not just about the DUP. It of course involves all the other parties, and they too are trying to apply similar pressure on the Treasury to move.
Yeah, and there does seem to be a general expectation that a new offer, an improved offer, is going to be put on the table by the NIO on behalf of the Treasury tomorrow afternoon. Where does all of that leave the process at this stage, Enda, in your view? We
do know, Mark, there were lots of conversations yesterday between all the key players in this process. And the government, I think, were making it very clear to the DUP the frustration that they're feeling because they were expecting a phone call from Sir Geoffrey Donaldson over the weekend to signal his party's intent to go back into the executive. Then the plan was, as far as the government is concerned, to bring the Assembly back early next week and for the Hunt system to be run, Deputy First and First Minister to be installed, and then, of course, devolution to be back up and running in full glory. Of course, that didn't happen. The email made it very clear that the DUP feels it's not exactly there yet. So the focus, I think, is going to switch very much now, Mark, tomorrow to Hillsborough Castle, where those financial talks are due to resume again. And I think you will start to see pressure coming on the Secretary of State to make a call around all of this, not least from the other parties, pretty frustrated at how this process is slowing down once again. And perhaps Chris Heaton-Harris will be asked by those parties, or maybe he might decide himself to declare the negotiations with the DUP on the Windsor framework are now over, and in a sense put it up to Sir Geoffrey Donaldson to make a call one way or another.
At what point do you think we're going to know if this deal is going to happen, and if it's going to happen, whether that will be potentially before or after Christmas? Is that clear at all?
Well, I think we should know in the next couple of days, Mark, because we know that window exists whereby Westminster rises for recess on Tuesday. The government was hoping to be able to lay some of the legislation which is going to be in this package on that occasion, so that the process could start to run effectively from that particular point. So I think we'll get a pretty strong indication tomorrow as to whether or not we're going to see anything happening in Westminster on Tuesday, if there's going to be any movement on any front around all of this. So I think we'll know pretty soon, because it's also worth remembering, Mark, that a lot has to happen between the DUP deciding they're going back in again and that process reaching that point. Because let's not forget, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson made a promise to his executive members back at their meeting in Lurgan a few months back that he would bring whatever decision the officers arrive at to the executive to, in a sense, be ratified by the 100 or so odd members there. We know that will take a bit of time, as opposed to organise that event, that gathering. And so that, in a sense, is a further complication, I think, for the party, because an awful lot has to happen over a short period of time.
And just finally and briefly, if you would, we've had a lot of deadlines, false deadlines, of course, as it turns out, during this process. Is there potentially some way in which this process can be parked over Christmas, but there is a new deadline introduced in the new year?
Well, I think it's very challenging for the government, because they built up a lot of momentum to this point, and they were of the belief, told Micheál Martin, for instance, this was going to be dealt with in a matter of days. So they're of the belief that this can be done before Christmas. But there is a new date, another date, if you like, lurking on the horizon, and that is January the 18th. That is a date by which the Secretary of State has to decide whether or not he's going to set a date for another Assembly election, if no executive, of course, has been formed in the meantime. And there is a sense that if we move beyond the Christmas period, that could be the date to be circled in the calendar as to whether or not we're going to see the parties restored back in the Assembly again, and if the DUP reach a decision as to whether or not that is going to be the course of action they're going to take. So once we get past Christmas and the new year, I would imagine people start talking about that date of January the 18th.
OK, that's if it's not resolved, of course, before Christmas. And a lot to discuss. Plenty of food for thought. Thank you very much indeed for joining us today. Well, let's find out what the parties make of where we are and what's likely to be in the executive ministers' in trays, if indeed they're appointed this week coming. I'm joined in the studio by the SDLP's Matthew O'Toole, who could find himself Stormont's official leader of the opposition. The role could, of course, go to the Ulster Unionist leader, Doug Beattie, if he decides his party's not joining a newly formed executive. Owen Tennyson is the Alliance Party's finance spokesperson, and John Finucane is the Sinn Féin MP for North Belfast. We're also joined down the line by the TUV leader, Jim Allister. And we did, of course, issue several invitations to the DUP to provide us with a representative today, but we're still waiting for a reply. And as you can see, no one from the party is here. So welcome to all of you who are joining us today. John Finucane, first of all, you were sitting in that very seat on Thursday night's edition of The View. Have you heard anything from the government or picked up anything on your radar since then about where this process is heading?
Well, what's clear this week is that there has been momentum. There has been momentum since Thursday night as well, when I was in the studio, as you point out. And it's clear that the time is now for Geoffrey Donaldson not to waste that momentum, not to waste the opportunity that is present.
What momentum since Thursday night?
I think it's time to show leadership, to recognise that there is a world outside the DUP, and that world is struggling badly in a cost of living crisis. It's a world where public sector workers, after public sector workers, are having to go out on strike. It's a world where people are on waiting lists. And it's time to finally recognise and take that momentum and the opportunity that is there to join with the other parties who from 20 months ago want to get back in and do the job that they were elected to do, to seize that moment now. Okay. And if he prevaricates and allows this to drift, then that will be to the detriment of everybody in this society as we face the pain of more and more underfunding.
Just briefly, Enda McClafferty is saying there it could happen this week, but it may well, could possibly bounce across into the new year, and he's talking about a potential new deadline of January the 18th. Just to be absolutely clear, since Thursday night, you've talked about new momentum. What does that look like? Where has that come from?
I said momentum is there. We have had a process all week, just to be clear on this in case I came across wrong. There has been momentum all week. We've also had, since Thursday night, more public sector workers who had to go on strike on Friday and Saturday.
But no major development since Thursday night that you would point us towards?
It is clear that there is an absence of a reason why we can't have an Assembly and executive back up and running straight away. And Geoffrey Donaldson needs to recognise that. He needs to recognise, as I've said, that there is a world outside of the DUP. Right. But I think, to be fair, Mark, To tell the families and workers of people who are having to fight for better pay and better conditions just to essentially suck it up over Christmas is not good enough. And again, people expect and deserve at the very least political leadership, and we need to have that shown by the DUP at long last.
OK, Owen Tennyson, what do you make of what we've heard so far, particularly what we've heard from Enda McLafferty, our political editor, that a deal could be done in the next few days, or the pause button might be hit and we could find ourselves having a conversation like this at the start of January? Which of those options seems more likely to you?
Well, look, you're asking me to second-guess the internal machinations of the DUP, Mark, and I've been asked to do that on numerous occasions over the past 2 years. And the reality is I can't predict what the DUP will do, because what the DUP want to do and what they will do are often two completely different things. But what I do know is that we have known the parameters of what any potential landing strip may look like. We've known what the key issues are, and we know that with political will, this can be landed this week. There's absolutely no reason why we can't be back in the Assembly pre-Christmas. I think people have been more than patient with the DUP over the last number of years. They've been looking into yet another Christmas with uncertainty about their pay awards. They are languishing on waiting lists. They can't get their children adequate support in schools. They are struggling with the cost of living crisis.
We've heard this a lot over the last 22 months, haven't we?
Mark, it bears repeating because it's important. I mean, this is the lived experience of people on the ground. This is the direct consequence of the actions of the DUP. And unless we take this opportunity, get back into government and start making life better for people, that situation will deteriorate.
So it's interesting you used the phrase about taking the opportunity to get back into government. You've spent 2 years in Alliance calling for the resumption of power sharing. Can I assume then, as we speak, that the Alliance Party's intention is to go back into a new executive if and when one is formed?
Yeah, and we have been clear. We want to see the Assembly and executive restored. We want to be part of that executive, but you know, Mark, that is a decision for our party council, and that will be informed by a whole range of factors. We have engaged in good faith over the past 2 years, laying the groundwork to enable the formation of Assembly and Executive, and we've been working alongside the other parties to do that. So yes,
but we've had programme for government talks now going on seemingly forever. So the Alliance Party's position, just to be absolutely clear, is your default position is that your intention would be to go into a newly formed executive.
Our intention is to go into an executive, but that is subject to approval by our party council. And we have been clear that this isn't just about getting the executive back for Alliance. It's about ensuring that executive is properly funded, and that is a conversation that can happen in parallel with restoration, but it's also about securing political stability.
Right.
I don't think the public will wear another situation. I don't think the public will wear another Christmas where they are witnessing this kind of pantomime politics where we're all traipsing back and forth from Hillsborough Castle for talks. They want their politicians working and delivering for them.
OK, Doug Beattie, as the leader of the Ulster Unionist Party, can we just clear this up first of all? Is it your party's intention to go into a newly formed executive, whether that's next week or whether it's January or at some stage in the future?
So interesting, Mark, we had our party executive meeting yesterday, and this very question was raised at that party executive meeting. And it's, as it stands right now, we are intent in going back into the executive. That's where we came from. That's where we will go back into. If that's going to have to change in any shape or form, and I have a recommendation to go into opposition, I will bring it back into the executive to give them the reasons for that, and that will be all.
So you, at the moment, you're out of step with your party colleagues because you think the Ulster Unionist Party would be better positioned not going into an executive. Is that what you're saying?
No, it's not. Absolutely not. No. And if I sort of extrapolate a little bit, what I said is yesterday we had our party executive meeting and we talked about this. We are intent and are moving towards going back into the executive.
But that's not your preferred option as leader.
I said my preferred option. Yeah. I have to see what the outworkings are of the financial package. I have to see what the outworkings are of the programme for government. I have to see the outworkings of what a new reformed executive will be like. Yeah. And then I will make a decision on that. And if that decision is this meets what we want, then we're straight back into the executive.
Yeah, but I just want to be absolutely clear. If it was down to you, Doug Beattie, leader of the party, you would be saying, don't go into an executive. No. But a majority, as I understand it, a majority of the decision makers within your party favour going back in again.
No, that's not where we stand at this moment in time. As we stand at this moment in time, we came from the executive and we are working to go back into the executive. That's clear. I can't say it any clearer. The difference being is if there's a decision that needs to be made to come out, it has to go to the executive. If there's no decision...
My understanding is that it is split 5-4 in favour of going into an executive, but you are one of the 4 who want to stay out of an executive. Is that correct or not?
No, where do you get 5-4 from?
Well, I'm not going to tell you where I got 5-4 from, but I understand that it is slipped to a majority within the decision-making body of the Ulster Unionist Party not to go back into an executive. I'm just asking you if that's right or not.
No, I'm trying to answer you. And if you're arguing to me that it's 5-4, I need to know where the number 9 comes from, because we have more than that in our party officers. So somebody is spinning a line about the number 9, and I can't get that. And I'm asking you the question, where do you get the figure 9 from to be a 5-4? I don't know where you get it from. So that's not true. So whoever's told you that has not been honest with you. So we haven't made that decision. The decision for the Ulster Unionist Party is we're going back into the executive. Yeah. And the only reason that changes is if I see something where I have to bring it to the executive to get them to change that decision. And that'll be up to them.
I think the 9 is your 9 MLAs, so that 5 MLAs support you going back in and 4 do not.
No, and we've not taken...
You don't recognise that?
No, absolutely not.
Okay, it's from a very good source, but you don't recognise it?
No, absolutely not, and we've not taken a single vote in regards to that.
OK, well, I guess we'll find out in due course, won't we? Matthew O'Toole, you style yourself as the Leader of the Opposition at the moment. You could be the Leader of the Opposition if Doug Beattie and his party do go into an executive, but of course, if they don't, Mr. Beattie would be the Leader of the Opposition, and you would have talked a lot about it, but actually not become that position.
Well, Mark, it's not really about party political titles or positions. It's about doing the job. We would still be in opposition, and it's a decision for the Ulster Unionist Party and indeed the Alliance Party to make. If any other party decides to go
you're going to be in opposition no matter what happens.
We will be in opposition. I mean, the way the rules work is that we will be in opposition. I mean, we are legally entitled to be in official opposition, just as we're not legally entitled to have a ministry in the executive. Unlike other parties, we're not in denial about the outcome of the election that happened nearly 2 years ago. We accepted the judgment of the electorate, which was that the SDLP would be in opposition. If we are there by ourselves, we will do the job, and we look forward to doing the job. If other parties wish to join us, I look forward to working constructively and actively in partnership with them, but that's obviously a decision for other parties.
How constructive is the SDLP going to be in that opposition role? Because the other parties, and we'll come on to this in a moment or two, are going to have some very difficult decisions to take. We know that there is a squeeze as far as public funding is concerned. So that's going to be challenging for the other parties. Are you going to be sympathetic to them in that decision-making process, or are you going to sit back and endeavour at all times to knock lumps out of them?
Well, look, being constructive means being constructive, but it also means being an opposition. Let me give you an example of how we've been constructive in opposition so far, to the extent that we've been able to do the role. This week we were invited along to the talks. We attended to understand the outlines of the package that was being presented to the parties and what the UK government's putting on the table in terms of a reviewed fiscal package. We participated, we gave our views. We then took a step back, not in a kind of walkout sense, but because we think, honestly, it's the job of the executive parties, those parties are entitled to be executive, to close that deal. But we support, actually, in large part, the points that are being made by other parties, including the 3 parties represented here next to me.
But can I just ask you about the independent review of education, which reported during the week, Matthew, suggested reallocating £170 million allocated for the Struhl Education Campus, and Daniel McCrossan, who's one of your MLAs, has made it very clear that he opposes that.
Daniel's a local MLA who has obviously worked in great detail on that particular project.
Yeah, he's your education
Mark,
spokesperson.
By no means does any opposition say that they will give a blank cheque to any incoming administration about what they do, but that doesn't mean that you have to spend your time carping opportunistically. People out there expect a robust opposition, but they also expect it to be constructive. But that doesn't mean we're going to pull our punches. It doesn't mean we're going to go along with every decision. I just want to say one thing about the importance of opposition, because as you're right in saying, you said that I've styled myself as the Leader of the Opposition. Very, very kind of you, Mark. It's not so much that I've styled myself like that. I do lead the Assembly Group, and we are going to be in opposition no matter what. So I have had, over the last 20 months, while we've been waiting for the DUP to allow us to do our jobs, the opportunity for people on the street, in shops and pubs, to tell me what they think of opposition. And they think it's critical and essential to doing government and politics better in this place. So we think it's an important role. We are going to perform it constructively, but that doesn't mean that we're not going to be robust. OK, let me bring in the TUV leader, Jim Allister, now. Mr. Allister, you must be delighted to hear there is a possibility that the DUP could well decide to let this run into the new year. I mean, presumably that gives you more time to marshal your forces to unpick it over the Christmas holidays.
Oh no, Mark, it's not about when, it's about if. And if the DUP go back into government, then they're going back in to implement the union dismantling protocol. They're going back in having accepted not one word of the protocol has been changed, that not one syllable, it would seem, of EU law has been disapplied, that Article 6 of the acts of union, which binds our economic union, it continues to be in suspension. Now, if the DUP do that, of course, it will be in total betrayal and conflict with their 7 tests. And they have no mandate to go back in because they fought not 1 but 2 elections.
Well, because you're not in the talks process, so you don't know precisely what's being discussed inside, and it could well be, presumably, it's a possibility that the DUP will say that its 7 tests have been met.
Well, it's not what the DUP say. The questions are these. Has Article 6 of the Act of Union been unsuspended?
Well, we don't know. We don't know the answer to any of this. Let's not go through the entire list. I mean, I think we know.
Has one word of the protocol been changed? Has the REC border been removed? Has 1 syllable of EU law been removed? And the answer to those will be pretty clear. And if the answer to those is in the negative, then the DUP has no mandate. And indeed, Sir Geoffrey should stand where we both stood with Doug Beattie when we made a joint unionist declaration of unalterable position being that the protocol must be rejected and replaced.
So have you tried to talk to Sir Geoffrey about this? Have you raised your concerns with him? Because you have indeed shared pro-union platforms with Sir Geoffrey in recent years. We know about that. We've seen the pictures. But it seems at the moment he may be in a different place from you. Have you had that conversation with him?
I've had a conversation 2-3 weeks ago with Sir Geoffrey, making very clear where I stand, making very clear where I believe he stood. And I'm not going to second guess exactly what he does, but I'm simply saying that if he goes back, leaving the protocol in place, then he's in blatant breach, as Doug Beattie is, of the joint declaration that
Do you trust Sir Geoffrey? Do you trust him to make the right decision for unionism?
I trust anyone who keeps their word. And if Sir Geoffrey keeps his word that the protocol must go, that it must be replaced, that EU law must be disapplied, that Article 6 must be restored, then he'll not be going where you're so keen for him to go, namely into an executive to implement the protocol. That is the price of the protocol. And of course, that is why the government is so desperate to get the DUP back, so that they can cement the protocol by unionist implementation.
Can I ask you this question? If Sir Geoffrey does decide that it is the right decision for unionism as he sees it, and he is the leader of the largest unionist party, so he has some clout in all of this, he has some agency. If he does that and he leads his party back into Stormont, are you going to take your seat in Stormont as well?
Well, I'm not in the executive, nor ever wish to be. I am an assembly member, and if the assembly's there, I will be there as a voice of opposition, as I have been for 10 years and more.
But you said on Thursday morning. Can I just remind people of what you said on Radio Ulster?
Their own principles.
Okay, apologies, there's a bit of a delay on the line. Can I just remind you what you said on Thursday morning on Radio Ulster? I'm quoting you directly. You said the only leverage unionism has ever had was staying out of Stormont. Such ameliorations as were obtained by staying out of Stormont. The moment we give up that leverage, the battle against the protocol is over. It is surrendered to the protocol. Now, that's Stormont, not the executive. So I'll ask you again. If he goes back in, are you going to go back in or are you going to stay out?
It's quite clear that the leverage that was exercised was by leaving the executive, and thereby Stormont, in terms of the Assembly, became largely defunct. The leverage is in not implementing the protocol. You implement the protocol by being in the executive. And you may wish to ensure there is no voice of opposition to a DUP surrender in that. But I assure you that if the Assembly returns to implement the protocol through an executive, which has no veto over any of the protocol, then I will be there as a voice of opposition and ensuring that those who have performed that betrayal of their own stand will be discomforted.
Okay, I mean, I don't wish anything. I'm just raising something that you said, and
I'm not so sure about that.
In a new context. Let me bring in John Finucane again. I want you all to address some of the very difficult decisions that incoming politicians, if there is a new executive, will have to take. John Finucane, in October 2016, Michelle O'Neill, now you're a candidate for First Minister, but then the Health Minister, committed herself to the Bengoa proposals, far-reaching proposals for the transformation of our health system. Are you prepared within Sinn Féin now to face up to the hard decisions involved in service relocation? Because it does seem some of your backbench MLAs are extremely uncomfortable about that prospect.
I think the context we need to set when we talk about decisions that we all would like to see executive ministers take is Some of the analysis we had on Thursday night, which I found very interesting, we have obviously been saying for a long time about the impact that Tory budgets and austerity has had here. But when you hear that independently verified by Lisa Wilson from the Nevin Institute talking about how we are overtaxed and underfunded, I think that as a starting point needs to be addressed, because prior to the Assembly and the Executive's collapse in advance of the last election, we had prioritised health in relation to a 3-year budget that ultimately wasn't agreed around the Executive table. We had identified additional money that needed to go to health. But as part of that is review, and it's looking at the management. So no more different than education, than the economy, health is very much front and centre, where ministers will need to work collectively around an Executive table to take tough decisions. But we need the resources and the tools to do that.
But it does seem a bit like you're making it up as you go along. Conor Murphy, when he was Finance Minister, appointed a fiscal council, and it reported that Northern Ireland needs £124 for every £100 spent in England. The government has said in its financial package that it accepts that, but now that's not enough. The parties want more.
No.
So there's the government saying, OK, well, we accept that. We will give you that. But you don't think it's enough?
No. I think that analysis has very much moved on. And what has been compounded over the past nearly 2 years now is when we look at the example of other devolved administrations that have been able to have talks about how they spend their money, how they pay back their money. The absence of an Assembly and an Executive over these past nearly 2 years has fundamentally weakened the society that we now live in, whether you point to health as an example, whether you point to your public sector workers, education, the community and the voluntary sector. We are all getting absolutely hammered.
Are you prepared to tackle the education system? We had a major review of education here that said we are spending far too much money providing education facilities in Northern Ireland. We could do it much more efficiently. But that might mean changing how we do things. It might mean, for example, closing small country schools. Is Sinn Féin prepared to do that?
Yeah, look, you're essentially throwing different issues that probably in and of their own right...
I'm throwing examples.
I know, but again, if I could be allowed to answer, each and every one of the examples that you have presented would probably merit an hour show on its very own to go into the detail. Whether we talk about health, whether we talk about education, I want to see the relevant minister around an Executive table working with their colleagues to tackle the issues that are there. But in the absence of an Executive, let's be very clear on this, and I know you want to move in, but we can't divorce the first half of this conversation from the second. In the absence of an Executive, in the absence from leadership being shown by Jeffrey Donaldson, we will be at the mercy, once again, of the Chris Heaton-Harrises of this world who will happily slice away our services to the point where the system, certainly with regards health, is described by those who are working within the system as bordering on collapse. And that isn't good enough. Right, but in answer to your question, yes, we want to be around an Executive table. We want to be in certainly the ministries that we will select. We want to be there taking the decisions to improve services for the betterment of everybody. And listen, that's what people voted for last year. They voted for their ministers to be doing that.
Right. OK, I understand that these are very complex issues, and you make a very fair point. We could talk about all of them in detail for a very long period of time. I think what viewers want to know is, are politicians going to be grown up about this if an Executive comes back and take difficult decisions? Now, the Alliance Party is on the record as saying, Owen Tennyson, that it is going to take those difficult decisions. It is going to engage with the whole issue, for example, of revenue raising. Can we just be absolutely clear that you are prepared to do that, even if it proves to be unpopular with voters? And at the end of the day, politicians need voters to give them office and power.
Well, Mark, we have a track record of embracing transformation where we believe that to be in the best interest of the people that we represent and where we believe it can deliver better outcomes for the public. So absolutely, Alliance is up for those difficult decisions. But crucially, this can't be about papering over the cracks, because no amount of transformation or revenue raising will ever counteract the fact that Northern Ireland is funded below the level of need. Now, the Treasury has conceded that in principle, but the package that is currently on the table in cash terms does not plug the gap. The fiscal floor operates more as a fiscal ceiling rather than the fiscal floor the parties have been demanding. So there's a fundamental issue, and the devil is in the detail around all of this. I believe that those gaps can be closed. But importantly, Mark, we would have been in a better position had we had an Executive in place doing this work over the course of the past 7 years, because we could have gone with the finance minister
let's look forward, not back.
In a position of strength to negotiate before we had dropped off a cliff.
Let me ask you this question. Is Alliance, let's just imagine that you end up being finance minister in a new government, whether that happens or not, in an Executive, or an Alliance party member ends up being finance minister. Is the party prepared to countenance things like introducing prescription charges again, a rates rise of 15%, lifting the domestic rates cap, and actually bringing in water rates, which could raise a figure something in the region of £350 million. Is all of that at least up for discussion?
Again, Mark, I mean, you've thrown a whole host of issues and there are a load of nuances.
But there are examples.
Within there.
There are real examples.
What we have said is, first of all, we need to bust this orthodoxy that Northern Ireland is not paying its way. Northern Ireland, as a proportion of GDP, is actually taxed higher than other regions of the UK, but there are areas of revenue raising where you can deliver better outcomes. So water is an example, where our proposal is that we would have a separate but not additional water charge, because we already pay for water, and so you could have a commensurate reduction in your regional rates to enable more capital investment by NI Water. That would be significant in terms of wastewater improvement and issues around Lough Neagh, for example. So where we can demonstrate that change and reform will deliver better outcomes, we're prepared to do that. What we will not countenance is simply charging the people of Northern Ireland more for less, and that is currently what's being proposed by the UK government.
Are you prepared to face up to these difficult decisions as well? I mean, if you go back in, you could end up, for example, being Health Minister again. You could end up with a member of the Ulster Unionist Party being the Education Minister. We know that Robbie Butler is your education spokesperson. We know that he has a particular interest in education. He might fancy that job. He'd have very difficult decisions to take, wouldn't he?
There's huge decisions to take, Mark, and we have a proven record of making difficult decisions. I mean, we took the health ministry when everybody else passed it by, and under Robin Swan, we brought forward a cancer care strategy. We brought forward an elective care strategy. We brought forward a mental health strategy. We brought forward a strategy to deal with the extortionate costs that we're paying for agency workers. All of those things were there, so we're willing to take those difficult decisions.
Or maybe you could make life an awful lot easier for yourself by sitting on the opposition benches and let the other parties take.
Yeah, but if you want to talk about the internal wranglings of the Ulster Unionist Party, then please carry on. But I'm trying to tell you what we're looking at going forward in an executive, because I've already told you that our intent is to go into an executive. And the question about revenue raising, every single one of these things have to be on the table to talk about the Mark. Every single one. You can't just say no, we're not going to talk about that, and that includes the likes of tuition fees. Do we raise tuition fees and get rid of the Mazin cap? If we get rid of the Mazin cap, can we make sure that there's 10,000 students up in the northwest? Can we make sure that we tie that down? Is there money to be made there? But then how do you direct that money? We've already talked about infrastructure. Do we need innovation bonds to raise money so that we can put it into infrastructure? All of these things need to be talked about. And we're there to talk about them, discuss them, and come up with the right solution. But we have to be funded properly in the first place. And if we're not funded properly in the first place, none of this will work.
All right, Matthew O'Toole, just very quickly, we're nearly out of time here, and I want to get to Jim Allister as well. If you're in opposition, when you're in opposition, if there is a newly established executive, can you give me an example of a revenue-raising issue that may be tabled by the parties in the executive that you would be comfortable with, that you would be happy to support from the opposition?
Well, the first thing to say, Mark, is we've actually published a set of relatively detailed proposals on some of this stuff earlier this year, our triple lock proposals, and in those we said, by all means, there does need to be, first of all, avoiding what Chris Heaton-Harris tried to do over the last year and indeed has done, which is impose punitive cuts in order to punish people here for the DUP's boycott. But yes, there also needs to be in the longer term a look at how we do revenue raising and managing our expenditure better. Now, that is a job for people who are going to be in the executive because they got that mandate. Okay. And this is a really important point here because there's this strange relationship which has happened between power and responsibility. People out there want to know that people who they vote for are able to take responsibility and take decisions that improve their lives in public services. Our job, the job they gave us, is to be in opposition, to hold them to account and challenge them on that. That doesn't mean carping, but it does mean it's not just a legitimate, it's an essential role that we need to play.
Okay, just Jim Allister, there's time for a very quick question and answer. We've got 30 seconds here before we need to move on. I just wanted to ask you, you made it very clear the concerns that you have about the way the DUP seems to be handling this and what might happen in terms of an executive being reformed. What are you, as the leader of the TUV, offering people that is practical, deliverable and realistic in the current circumstances?
That as unionists, we must hold the line to ensure that the union is restored and we don't put our hands to the dismantling of the union, which what the protocol is all about. But on this financial question, I have to make this point. There's been shameless blackmail by the Secretary of State that none of these parties have called out. Secretary of State recognises there's financial need of $2.5 billion, but he's making it conditional upon unionists rolling over. Anyone who cares about our public health workers should be calling out the Secretary of State on that and saying, if you recognise the need exists, then pay the money, whether or not there is an executive. Don't
strategy would be to give them more
resort to
power, by the
blackmail
way.
as you are.
OK. We're out of time, folks. Appreciate you all taking part in the programme. Thank you very much indeed for joining us today. That's where we are now, 2 weeks away from the end of the year. But what about the last 12 months? We've gathered together a panel of keen political observers to reflect on the ups and downs of 2023. And like a lot of conversations at the moment, it began with the state of unionism.
I think unionism is in a really difficult position of their own making. Again, trying to make jokes, and we go, what about the sinners? They've done nothing. They've said nothing. They've done nothing because they're sitting going, where you go, lads? You have your row about the protocol, which nobody understands. Nobody knows what the 7 tests are. Nobody knows. They vaguely think it's something to do with a sausage going through Lauren, and that's about the height of it. And all this nonsense about, this is undermining the union. Do people really think it's undermining?
I hope you're not saying there's anything wrong with Lauren.
I wouldn't dare have said that. No, Ballycarry was the centre of the universe, but Lauren's the second.
But I think that, the fundamentals are there. Unionism was very concerned about what the protocol meant, what did it do to the union. We were given this idea that, we were going to be the sort of the Hong Kong of Europe, effectively, and it was going to be really good. But then there's still that concern that there's an ongoing historical narrative here, and it's not good as far as unionism's concerned.
I think the interesting thing, though, is not unionism or the union, it's Britishness, and where Britishness sits today. So after the resignation of Nicola Sturgeon, you would have thought that was the real opportunity for unionism to sell the union, to say, this independence isn't going to work. It hasn't happened because it's not a union of equals in that England is very much about the South. It's about the wealth in the South, the wealth around London. The Conservative Party is largely in the South. The talk of levelling up was actually probably a good idea, which simply didn't happen.
It has become modern identity politics, which is essentially sterile. It's not a rational argument. It's just how you feel. And the last advantage that unionism has is inertia, and the fact that most of us here feel some kind of affinity to Northern Ireland itself. And the idea of abolishing a modern state and forming a new one is so incomprehensible, and we can't manage even the basics, like running a health service, that people just tend to freeze in the headlights and give up on it. So that really is what's holding up the union at the minute.
And also because we've been through a pandemic, we've been through the toxic Brexit negotiations, we've been through a financial crisis. Most people want a period of status quo.
Yes.
They want a period of stability in their lives for them and for their children.
But the problem, of course, Gareth, for unionism is that there will be people who will think they'll remember the details of May's local government elections, and they'll say that just furthers the narrative that unionism is under pressure, and maybe in some people it encourages that siege mentality. But, Sinn Féin overtook the DUP as the biggest party in local government. It's the first time that nationalists outnumbered unionists in councils. Sinn Féin up 39 seats. The DUP no change at 122, and Alliance up 14 seats from 53 to 67. There was a very, very clear example of what was happening there, wasn't there?
I think there is a feeling that if the DUP didn't exist, Sinn Féin would have to invent them. The DUP's clearly easily won the unionist argument, but when it's been doing that, Sinn Féin have surged ahead. And obviously they are in place. If the Stormont comes back, Michelle O'Neill will be the First Minister. They had a tsunami, in the words of Naomi Long, in the local government elections, and I think quite a lot of that is nationalists giving their vote to Sinn Féin, perhaps lending their vote, maybe more than that, to give the DUP a bloody nose, because Michelle O'Neill has not spent one day in the First Minister's office. I think the DUP needs to, when it gets itself sorted out over will it go back or will it not, it's got to ask itself the question, as you say, Sinn Féin don't have to do much, or haven't had to do much, but just let the DUP do it for them.
And people don't lend their votes. That's what the SDLP discovered.
Well, once they lend them once,
they
give them back. Yeah.
And the other thing is, I think nationalists feel that we've spent at least the last 12 months, if not the last 2 years and more, talking about unionism, the union, the unionist concerns, the DUP, the psychodrama within the DUP, and there's very little narrative about nationalists, what they want, where they feel they fit into this.
Sometimes people ask, why do you keep talking about unionism? It's because that's where that's where the focus has to be.
But also that appears to be where Sinn Féin is quite happy to have it at the moment, because don't interrupt your opponent when he's making a mistake, and because it's an open goal for Sinn Féin to allow people to imagine that everything would be fine if Michelle O'Neill was First Minister. She doesn't have to specify any policies. People just project their hopes onto this blank slate.
That's it. She's used a couple of times in an Assembly speech the term Northern Ireland. She wished the Northern Ireland football team good luck.
And they won.
And they won.
They did.
Now, that is a first. Now, no unionist really is going to give her much credit for that, but no doubt that's softening the First Minister for all argument is there writ large.
But also it's worth noting in terms of the Northern Ireland football team, so we have the opportunity 30 years after the Good Friday Agreement to have the Euros, the second most prestigious football competition in the world, coming to us. Can you imagine the tourism, the media attention, and we can turn it into an orange and green issue. I mean, it's absolutely
Well, some people
extraordinary.
did, but maybe that could be overplayed, because there were people clearly involved with the Northern Ireland football team who welcomed that development.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah. You had a nice picture taken with, you could be sometimes very critical of the DUP and critical of Geoffrey Donaldson, but I distinctly remember seeing a picture of you at Windsor Park with Sir Geoffrey.
And my answer to that is very simple. You separate the policy from the person. It's very possible to say, I don't really agree with your policy. In fact, I don't agree with many of your policies, but as a person, you're perfectly good company and we had a great time. And, as you say, Northern Ireland won. What more do you want?
Tell you another thing we need to talk about, and that is the Good Friday Agreement 25th commemoration. Back in April, Queen's University marked the 25th anniversary with a major international conference, and of course Ulster University played host to President Joe Biden. You were in the middle of that, Deirdre.
That's right. And I suppose, yes, of course, you know, it was right to celebrate, right to acknowledge, but there was a juxtaposition between having this glitzy celebration of 25 years and how wonderful we were. Although I would say, you know, it was an extraordinary achievement. It was an intractable conflict where we found a way out of it. But I think possibly many people watching thought, what on earth is going on here? We have no government. We have a cost of living crisis. We have a health service in crisis. We have strikes all across the public sector. It just doesn't sit well. So, of course, I feel like they had to go ahead with it, but I can understand why people were very critical and felt to find the balance was extraordinarily difficult.
But the two universities, I think, came out of it very well. I mean, it was a big deal for Ulster to have Joe Biden there opening the new campus. And Queen's, you know, put on a pretty good show in Belfast as well and had all kinds of luminaries there. President Clinton, Tony Blair, George Mitchell, Bertie Ahern and many others as well.
I think we have to remember, for our size and for the size of the population, we have extraordinary pulling power in the international stage, and there's still extraordinary interest in what's happening here, and people with vested interest to say, we were part of this, we want to see this work, we want to see it achieve something.
That only, in a way, that only highlights how tragic it was to have had yet another anniversary after the 20th one, where the world turned up and Stormont was down. So I think it was undoubtedly embarrassing, and I clearly got...
It was embarrassing, you'd go that far?
I clearly got the impression that it left the public cold and embarrassed.
Was there too much focus on the great and the good in some of those?
Well, there always is, isn't there? And there always has been right from even before the Good Friday Agreement. And a presidential visit was the epitome of a sort of peace process theatre, and it still is.
The whole week reminded us what we could have won. And we're not where people thought we should be. I mean, Joe, it was kind of a competition, I thought, between the two universities.
No, we're never in competition. How could you think that?
University of Ulster won Joe Biden, who came and behaved himself pretty well, even though he mixed up the black and tans and the All Blacks.
Not with us, he didn't.
No, he didn't. He behaved himself very well in the University of Ulster. Then he went home and said he only came to Northern Ireland to stop the Brits screwing around, which was a bit of a gaffe, I think. I mean, I covered that event at Queen's. I have to say it was an excellent event, but there were some people there who I was I had to take a double take. Ian Paisley was there, and Jamie Bryson was there.
Yeah,
and I thought that was interesting.
Well, that certainly raised a few eyebrows.
And then there was the Senator Mitchell's speech, a man who we didn't even think would be able to go because of his health. He made that great speech about the 100%ers that all parties have. I think he was aiming that mainly at one party, I have to say, and perhaps one of the people in the audience might have recognised themselves at that speech. But it was, I mean, I loved it.
And we'll not see the like again, presumably, Tim. I mean, to see a lineup
that
like
necessarily isn't a bad thing. We need to stop living 25 years ago, to be fair.
Well, the Biden thing was interesting. I mean, mixing up the black and tans and the All Blacks is, you know, it's easy enough because both of them tortured the Irish for years. You know, but Biden's visit was very brief, and the whole thing about him, you know, he literally, I think he said 15 hours, didn't he? 8 of them were asleep, and a few others were asleep when he was making a speech as well.
That very eggy meeting with Rishi Sunak in the Grand Central.
It was
very awkward body language.
He clearly couldn't wait to get down south, basically, and have a pint with the lads, you know, and basically we're the embarrassing cousin up north.
Dublin riots, again, just at the end of the year, caught a lot of people by surprise, I think, Newton.
It's caused Sinn Féin to step up its attempt to become the law and order party, which is quite an audacious move.
Well, I think they've already backed away from that audacious move, and they're now back to housing, because actually what it revealed was when they started to say that they wanted a vote of no confidence in the Justice Minister, Helen McEntee, on the back of a 3%. That's what the public opinion said. 3% of them said she wasn't doing her job properly. And of course they called for Drew Harris to step down as well.
Well, was that just political opportunism?
But what it really showed is they didn't read the room.
There's something else going on as well, which is Sinn Féin support has dropped in 2 opinion polls in a row.
But on the back of that?
No, since the attack on Israel. Since then, this is the longest, deepest drop it's had in the opinion polls since it rise 3 years ago. That can't be a coincidence. It doesn't mean that people or Sinn Féin supporters don't sympathise with people in Gaza, but I think it does mean that a large part of that voter base is thinking, is this the priority we want for for the party we vote for? Is it too partisan on this issue? And so people are, I think, stepping a little bit back from their support for Sinn Féin, and that's put the party in a very difficult position. It ties in with this issue of immigration and resentment against people from Muslim countries in particular that you can see on the internet. It's put the party in a real bind. Now, to its credit, as everyone acknowledges, it's not giving in to any temptation for racism, but it doesn't really know what to do.
Yeah, David, did it depress you that a lot of people in Northern Ireland divided along very predictable lines as far as Israel and Palestine is concerned?
Well, I think we put our own historical constructs here on Israel and Palestine too. There has to be a long-term resolution to this, and I think a lot of people don't see that it involves Hamas, that it should involve a constitutional body rather than a terrorist group. So I think it's been appalling what's happened. It was appalling on the 7th of October what happened in Israel, and it was entirely predictable how the reaction would come, what reaction would come from Israel, because it had to try and secure its boundaries. It had to try and take action against Hamas. But I mean, I think there has to be a solution that acknowledges that Israel has the right to exist. That's the first thing, because if that isn't acknowledged, then we're at this whole situation all over again where you continue on down the line with what inspired Hamas to begin with. So I think there has to be an acknowledgement of that, and there has to be a way forward that treats the Palestinians with respect as well.
Well, the PLO did acknowledge that Israel exists as well, and you know there's evidence that says that Netanyahu and his supporters were promoting Hamas and were supporting Hamas as a force against the PLO, and they're deliberately wrecking the two-state solution. And I'm sorry, but again, it is very interesting in Northern Ireland. I literally do a joke about, you know, I'd be crass to ask who's Catholic or who's Protestant in an audience, but I go hands up who supports Israel and who supports the Palestinians, and it works every time. People go, oh, yeah, it is, and it really. Again, coming from my background, I'd be far more pro-Palestinian, obviously, than David is.
Let's try to end on a positive note. There's so much potentially happening next year of interest, maybe as many as 3 elections in the Republic, locals, Europeans, and a general election. We've got the prospect of a general election in the UK as Rishi Sunak's government seems to struggle to take control of the narrative. Possibility of Stormont coming back. What are you looking forward to, Newton?
Oh, the presidential election in Taiwan next month, which could start World War III. So if we can get through that,
I said on a lighter note,
on a lighter note, right? If we can get through that and avoid Armageddon.
I think next year Sir Geoffrey will be off. I can't see, even if there's a return to Stormont, I think he will be off to the red benches, and he will have said, "My work here is done." And
is that what you chatted about?
Well,
Windsor
I
Park.
told you what happened in Windsor Park stays in Windsor Park, but I believe that he will not return.
David, what are you looking forward to?
Well, I'm interested next year and to see what happens, because somebody on the panel was at Downing Street with Rishi Sunak recently, so I'm not sure if there's any positions coming up.
We do need to ask you about that occasion. You were on the inside.
I was on the inside. It was wonderfully pointless. I don't know what the whole point of it was. They brought a collection of, some people might call them the great and the good. There were actors and comedians, and there were people, the arts organisations, and everybody kind of going, what are we doing here? I just went because it was Downing Street, and Rishi turned up, didn't make a speech or anything, said nothing, and kind of disappeared again.
What am I looking forward to? I'm looking forward to Jeffrey Donaldson. Does he watch? Does he listen to this? A nice, quiet Christmas, Jeffrey, please.
Thanks to Professor Deirdre Heenan, Newton Emerson, Dr. David Hume, Tim McGarry, and Gareth Gordon, and it looks like Gareth isn't getting his quiet Christmas after all. If you enjoyed that, by the way, there's a bumper edition of The Conversation available on our Red Lines podcast. You'll find that on BBC Sounds or wherever you get your podcasts. Plenty to talk about now with commentators Alex Kane and David McCann. Welcome to both of you. I want to concentrate on that conversation that we had earlier with the politicians, that roundtable conversation. David, first of all, Enda McClafferty raised the prospect of a new deadline, potentially of January the 18th. All eyes are on Sir Geoffrey Donaldson at the moment, but nothing from the DUP in the last couple of days. Radio silence.
Yeah, it seems to be, at this stage, it's very unlikely that we'll probably get some movement this side of Christmas. I think that...
Unlikely, you think?
I think it's unlikely, yeah, just for the very simple... As Enda was alluding to, Geoffrey Donaldson has promised more wider consultation within the DUP. I just struggle to see how he's going to do that within the next 2 to 3 days in order to get a deal over the line. That deadline, though, I think of the 18th of January, I think is key, because that will focus minds. The Secretary of State's a bit of a busted flush on this in terms of not calling elections. But I think in terms, if you think back to New Decade New Approach, when the government injected momentum, they did that after the Christmas break, and that could inject some new urgency into the process.
Does that make sense to you, Alex? Because Sir David Stirling, sitting at this table on Thursday night on The View, warned about the possibility of a deal being put off until after Christmas into the new year, and then, as he put it, the mice nibbling at it. And there are plenty of people lining up to try to destroy any potential deal if that happens.
Oh, I think that is the greatest danger for Geoffrey Donaldson right now. I agree with David. I'm not expecting anything before Christmas, not least because, as Enda said earlier, they have to have the DUP executive has to meet, and they're not going to be meeting in the next few days. But the problem is, it's not only Donaldson's internal opponents, and I think my own instinct, and talking to people, is that he probably has the numbers of the officer team and the executive and the MLAs.
But if that's the case, why does he not get on with it then?
Because
if he has the numbers and if he knows it could be unpicked over Christmas, why would he wait?
Well, that would be... I would have argued that. I'm a firm believer. If you know you're going to go somewhere, go hard, go fast, and let people know what you're doing.
Because the danger is he looks indecisive.
Well, yeah, I think that he's always looked indecisive, particularly in the past 2 years. But his other problem is he doesn't know how to deal with his external opponent. He doesn't know what the LCC, the Orange Order, the TUV, he doesn't know how they're going to manage. And the difficulty is, the longer he leaves it, Mark, those people will be meeting. Even if the DUP executive doesn't meet, those people will be meeting. And we heard from Jim there, there are a lot of unionists and loyalists who would see it as betrayal. And back in, when the DUP had to make its big decision in 2007 about doing the deal with the Sinn Féin, the Martin McGuinness and Paisley deal, they knew that there was no one to their right who was going to do them any damage, because the TUV didn't even exist. Circumstances are different this time. The DUP know that unionists and loyalists do have another option, and that, I think, is worrying them more than anything right now.
But you have to say a factor in the discussion or the thinking within the DUP has to be, presumably, about an alternative. What is the alternative for the party if it decides not to go back into an executive? Because that brings us back into the whole debate about Plan B, and Plan B would involve a greater say for the Dublin government, and from a unionist perspective, that wouldn't be something that would be welcomed.
No, absolutely. And this has always been the quandary since the DUP became the largest party of unionism that they've always faced. And that was how they justified going going into government with Sinn Féin in 2007. I just think that for Jeffrey Donaldson, like, he's searching for unanimity that he's never going to get. Ian Paisley didn't get unanimity about going into government with Sinn Féin. Peter Robinson didn't get unanimity over the devolution of police and injustice. There's coming a point, and it is coming soon, it will be within the next few weeks, where Jeffrey Donaldson essentially needs the Fisher Cup bid. He needs to put the line down to his party. Look, as Alex is saying, this is where we need to go to secure the union, and this is where the DUP's best position as a party of government needs to be. We're not going to be like the TUV or some of their rivals shouting from the sidelines. We're going to be a party of government.
Can we talk about the Ulster Unionist Party? Because it was interesting there from Doug Beattie. He says that the party's position at the moment would be, the preference would apparently be to go back into government. But as we understand it, as far as the MLA team is concerned, it is a 5-4 split, and Mr. Beattie is one of the 4 who is making the case for the party not to go back into an executive.
I think the difficulty for the UUP, if you go back to 2015, when they did, where they were the voice of opposition, that was after John McAllister's bill had been passed, and there was an official funded, an opposition which had clout, and they went into the experiment, the Colin Mike devolution experiment or opposition experiment. They only got a few months of that. There's still a section of the UUP that wants to do that, or wants to prove that when you have an election, you have an alternative to the DUP Sinn Féin axis. And also they will tell you, and it's a fair point, I think the SDLP would tell you the same thing, and Alliance would have told you as well, going back 2015-16, the smaller parties do not get the kudos for the big decisions that are made. They'll get the blame for the small things, oh, you stopped it and so on, but the DUP and Sinn Féin will claim credit for everything. And I think there is an argument, I think that the UUP and SDLP should look very seriously at opposition and say, right, we'll look at the election, which is 3 years away. We want to be a genuine, not just one party, but the 2 or 3 of us sitting here want to be an alternative government in 3 years' time. That, I think, honestly, is probably, and I've always been someone who favours the opposition, I think that's a much better option than sitting in an executive where they will be torn from pillar to post by the 2 big parties.
So that's effectively vote Doug, get Matthew.
Yeah, it's essentially, yeah. But like, even when they had one of the most highest profile ministries during the pandemic, Robin Swan was by country mile, the most popular politician in Northern Ireland. Outside of North Antrim, didn't land the UUP a single vote. And Doug has always been someone that's favoured opposition. Again, I think he wanted opposition in 2020. And as Alex has said, not only is their influence limited, but because their electoral strength is so weak, they will get one of the last picks in the Dáil. So they're going to get lumbered with basically a department that's going to be riddled with problems. They're not going to get one of the top picks, and it'll be essentially one of the departments that the main parties just don't want, and that's what they're going to get landed with.
What about, because we've talked a lot about unionism, that's where the jeopardy is. What about the defining moment this will be for nationalism if later this week or early next year we see Michelle O'Neill finally taking up that position as First Minister?
Yeah, look, it's going to be a huge symbolic moment because, again, Northern Ireland was set up for that never to ever happen, and again, Sinn Féin will relish that. But then the rubber will start hitting the road because there's a lot of expectations on Sinn Féin now being the lead party in the executive, even though they don't have any more power. But again, Sinn Féin, we expect, would take the economy department. There'll be big pressure on places like the Northwest. Can they get university places up in places like Magee? So again, Sinn Féin will really need to see delivery because, again, that symbolism is going to have to be matched with substance because symbolism only lasts so long.
Very significant moment for nationalism, and maybe that will make a lot of unionists very uncomfortable.
It will make them uncomfortable. And you have to go back, Mark, go back to the 2017. I mean, I always said that Assembly election, that perception and psychology are hugely and usually often underestimated elements of politics. 2017, the Unionists for the first time ever came back after an Assembly election or any election in which they didn't represent the majority at that place. Move ahead 5 years later, they're no longer the biggest party. I know from experience, I know partly from the emotional and personal side of it, what a huge psychological blow that was to unionism. Shift that around to nationalism, who for the first time is seeing itself in the position, having played by all the rules, which they're told, this is how it wins. If you're the biggest party, you become first, we're the biggest, we become, and then being told, oh, well, we'll hang this. And that's the thing I think unionists need to understand. There's an awful lot of nationalism, soft nationalism, harder republicanism, that thinks they're being kept out because unionists don't want a Sinn Féin First Minister. OK, we've got to leave it there, folks. That's something we're going to come back to, I have no doubt, in the weeks and months ahead. Thank you both very much indeed. That's it for today and for this year. If Stormont returns this week, we'll have plenty of coverage across BBC News NI, on TV, radio and online. We'll be back with The View, Sunday Politics and Red Lines in the new year, of course. But for now, from everyone in the team, thanks for watching. Have a happy and peaceful Christmas and New Year. Bye-bye.